That's 17 rejections today.
Good. I wasn't looking for a laborer.
Then why are you here? Because I need a co-pilot. For what mission?
One that'll probably kill us both.
She stood in the bonding market under flickering neon, lungs burning with the smell of cheap ozone and desperation. 17 rejections. 17 males who looked at her scars and saw broken goods. Then came the human. He didn't offer salvation. He offered a suicide mission. The metal grating of the viewing platform bit through the thin soles of Kendra's boots. She shifted her weight, ignoring the sharp spike of pain that shot up her left leg, right where the synthetic nerve grafts met native tissue. The air in Sector 4 of the New Providence Orbital Station was a heavy, humid soup. It smelled of spilled industrial lubricants, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of the station's failing scrubbers. Kendra kept her eyes fixed on the rusted bulkhead across the concourse. If she looked down, she would see the faces of the prospective sponsors. She didn't want to see them. She didn't want to see the exact moment their mild curiosity curdled into disgust. A heavy set of footsteps stopped at the base of her podium. Kendra forced her gaze downward. The male standing there was named Bradley. The translation collar around his thick, scaled neck supplied the westernized moniker in a flat, synthesized baritone. He belonged to a merchant clan from the inner rings wealthy enough to afford a custom-tailored atmospheric coat, practical enough to be shopping in the bargain sector for a bonded laborer. In this market, a bond wasn't a marriage. It was a contract of survival. You traded your physical labor, your genetics, and your loyalty in exchange for a clan's protection and a stipend. Her sister, Lily, was starving on a frozen dust ball 3 systems over. Kendra needed the stipend. Bradley picked up the datapad attached to her podium. The screen illuminated his wide, unblinking eyes. He swiped through her medical history. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant, rhythmic thud of the station's atmospheric compressors. Kendra held her breath. Just look past it, she thought. I can still work. I can still lift. Bradley's eyes flicked from the pad to her left shoulder. The heavy industrial canvas of her tunic couldn't hide the blocky, utilitarian shape of the prosthetic arm bolted to her collarbone. It was a cheap replacement. Exposed servos whined a high, irritating pitch every time she twitched. Below the collar of her shirt, thick, raised burn scars crawled up her neck, a permanent reminder of the plasma breach that had killed her previous crew and left her a mutilated outcast. Structural integrity is compromised, Bradley said. The collar translated his clicking native tongue into standard basic. The left quadrant muscle mass is gone. Cortical response times in the artificial limb are sluggish. I can haul 50 kilos standard, Kendra said. Her voice came out raspy, completely stripped of the deferential softness expected of a prospect. The graphs hold under pressure. I've tested them. Bradley dropped the datapad back onto its magnetic mount with a harsh clatter. You are defective goods. I require a laborer, not a scrap project. The upkeep on those servos alone would drain the stipend. He turned his back, not waiting for her response, and merged back into the flow of the crowded market. 18. That was 18 rejections today. Kendra let her chin drop. A bead of sweat stung her eye, but she didn't raise her real hand to wipe it away. The deep, heavy exhaustion in her bones wasn't just physical anymore. It was a cold, spreading rot in her chest. The market was closing in an hour. The neon signs above the stalls were already beginning to flicker and buzz, cycling down for the station's simulated night. She was going to be evicted from the boarding house tomorrow. And Lily wasn't going to make it through the planetary winter. She reached up, fingers fumbling with the clasp of the identification placard around her neck. She was done. There was no dignity left to wring out of this place. The actuator on that shoulder joint, a voice said. It's military grade. Old, but military. Kendra froze. She hadn't heard anyone approach. She looked down. He was a human. Kendra's stomach tightened. Humans didn't come to the bonding markets. They were a chaotic, fringe species. Deathworlders who built ugly ships and fought ugly wars. They were tolerated on the trade hubs only because their currency was good and their mercenaries were cheap. This one didn't look wealthy. He was leaning against the railing of her podium, looking up at her, with narrow, bloodshot eyes. He wore a faded canvas jacket stained with old grease and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. His dark hair was cut short, uneven, and he hadn't shaved in days. He smelled strongly of stale coffee, ozone, and cheap alcohol. "It's a surplus mining prosthetic," Kendra lied, her voice flat. "Not military." The human let out a short, rough exhale that might have been a laugh. He rubbed the back of his neck. His knuckles were raw and split. "Right. And I'm the Emperor of Orion. I know an M74 articulation joint when I see one. They use them on heavy ordnance loaders, which means they bolted that thing directly into your spinal column so you could take the recoil." Kendra's jaw clenched. She felt a sudden, sharp spike of defensive anger. "Are you here to bid on the contract? Or are you just here to inventory my parts?" He looked at her, really looked at her. There was no pity in his face, no disgust at her scars. His eyes were dark, flat, and aggressively tired. "My name is Wyatt," he said, "and I don't want a bonded laborer. I want a co-pilot." Kendra stared at him. The market buzzed around them, a chaotic blur of alien dialects and shuffling boots, but her focus narrowed entirely to the human standing below her. "A co-pilot? Yeah, I'm an indentured prospect. I don't fly." "Your file says you used to," Wyatt countered, tapping the edge of her datapad with a dirty fingernail. "Before the plasma breach. You navigated deep space freighters. You know the slipstream. That was 5 years ago. I'm a cripple." Wyatt pushed off the railing. He stepped closer. The smell of him acrid, human sweat, and burnt copper was overpowering. "I don't care if you're missing half your brain, as long as the half that's left can calculate a hyperspace vector under fire. You want out of this meat market? I've got a job. It pays 300,000 credits, half up front." Kendra's heart gave a violent, painful thump against her ribs. 300,000 credits. That wasn't just survival. That was a ticket off-world for Lily. That was a new life. But humans didn't offer that kind of money for simple freight runs. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Wyatt offered a grim, humorless smile. "We're running the Aegis Cordon, tonight, and the cargo is highly unstable. If we get hit, we don't just crash. We vaporize." He held out a rough, calloused hand. "Buy you a drink while we negotiate our impending deaths?" The station cantina, a hollowed-out lower-deck storage bay, known as the Rust Bucket, was exactly where a human would suggest a meeting. The lighting was dim, casting long, bruised shadows across the warped floor grates. A thick haze of synthetic smoke hung in the air, stinging Kendra's eyes. She sat in a cramped corner booth. The synthetic leather of the bench was cracked, leaking yellow foam. She kept her prosthetic arm resting on the table, the servos humming faintly. The table itself was sticky, smelling of sour yeast and spilled ethanol. Wyatt slid into the booth opposite her. He set 2 glasses of a murky, amber liquid on the table, pushing one toward her. Some of the liquid sloshed over the rim, leaving a wet ring on the scored metal. Kendra didn't touch it. "The Aegis Cordon is a military blockade," she said, cutting straight to it. "It's heavily fortified by automated gunships and proximity mines. Nothing gets through without a diplomatic transponder. You're asking me to fly into a meat grinder." Wyatt took a sip from his glass. He didn't even flinch as the harsh liquor went down. "I'm not asking you to fly into it. I'm asking you to fly through it." "With what? Magic?" With a localized EMP burst and a whole lot of speed, Wyatt set his glass down. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The casual slouch he'd held in the market was gone. Up close, the tension in his shoulders was obvious. The man was tightly wound, vibrating with an underlying frantic energy. "I have a ship. She's fast. Faster than anything the Aegis Patrol runs. But she's old. Her navigational computer is a joke. If I push the thrusters past redline, the autonav can't keep up with the debris field. I need an organic navigator." "There are hundreds of pilots on this station," Kendra said. "Why me? Why pull a broken prospect from the bonding market?" Wyatt traced the wet ring on the table with his thumb. For a second, the cynical armor cracked, revealing something desperate and raw underneath. "Because standard organics black out at 10 Gs, he said quietly. "Your species, your skeletal density is nearly twice that of a human. And that military-grade spine they gave you, it's designed to handle massive kinetic shock. You won't black out. You'll stay awake while I break every speed regulation in the sector, and you'll keep us from smashing into an asteroid." Kendra looked at her prosthetic. The metal was dull, scratched, and if the graphs tear, then we die, Wyatt said bluntly. "We become a cloud of rapidly expanding plasma." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, heavy data chip. He dropped it on the table between them. It landed with a dull clink. 150,000 credits. Untraceable. Transferable right now to any account you name. You can send it to your family before we even step onto the flight deck. Kendra stared at the chip. The scratched surface caught the dim light of the cantina. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was Lily's medicine. It was a secure biodome. It was food, heat, safety. "What is the cargo?" she asked. Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Does it matter? If it's going to vaporize me, yes." He let out a long breath, running a hand over his face. The sound of his rough palm against his stubble was loud in the small booth. "It's an unstable core from a decommissioned dreadnought. A buyer in the Outer Rim wants it for a terraforming project. Or a bomb. I don't ask, and I don't care. I just know the containment field is degrading. We have about 40 hours before it cooks us alive inside the hull." Kendra felt a cold sweat break out along her spine. "You are insane. You're strapping yourself to a dying star and hoping you outrun the explosion." "I don't have a choice," Wyatt said. His voice dropped, losing all its aggressive edge. It was just hollow now. "I owe a lot of money to people who like to collect in pieces. If I don't deliver this core, they'll find me. They'll find my brother in the core worlds. This is my last hand. I'm playing it." Kendra looked at him. Humans were terrifying. They were fragile bags of water and bone, easily punctured, easily broken. Yet they pushed themselves into the jaws of certain death with a stubborn, terrifying momentum. Wyatt wasn't a hero. He was a cornered animal. She understood that perfectly. She had been cornered since the day the plasma breach melted half her body. Slowly, deliberately, Kendra reached across the sticky table. Her prosthetic fingers, cold and unyielding, closed around the data chip. "Transfer this to the account I specify," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid, frantic beating of her heart. "Then show me your ship." Wyatt didn't smile. He just nodded once, the tension in his jaw easing a fraction of an inch. "Deal." Docking Bay 14 was a freezing cavern of exposed wiring and leaking coolant. The smell of ammonia burned the back of Kendra's throat with every breath. She walked a few paces behind Wyatt, her heavy boots clanking against the steel decking. Sitting in the center of the bay was Wyatt's ship. Kendra stopped, staring at it. "You're joking." The Outbound was practically a flying junk pile. The hull was a patchwork of mismatched armor plating some matte black, some bare, scratched titanium. Scorch marks streaked across the starboard engine nacelles, and the main thruster looked like it had been welded together by a blind mechanic. It didn't look fast. It looked like a derelict waiting to be scrapped. "She ain't pretty," Wyatt muttered, punching a sequence into the rusted access panel near the airlock. "But she's got it where it counts. The drive core is stripped from a military courier. I gutted the life support redundancy and the cargo shielding to drop the weight." "You removed the shielding?" Kendra asked, horrified. "From a ship carrying a degrading energy core?" "Hey, it forces us to fly faster," Wyatt said, slapping the panel. The airlock hissed open, spitting a cloud of stale, recycled air into the bay. "After you." Kendra stepped inside. The interior was cramped, lit by harsh red emergency lighting. The deck plates vibrated underfoot, humming with an angry, uneven power. The air smelled of burnt dust, old rations, and ozone. She had to duck to avoid a bundle of exposed fiber optic cables hanging from the ceiling. She made her way to the cockpit. There were 2 seats. They were worn, the synthetic leather torn and patched with duct tape. She lowered herself into the co-pilot's chair. It was designed for a human frame. The lumbar support dug painfully into her rigid spine, and the armrest was too low for her bulky prosthetic. She forced herself to ignore the discomfort, reaching for the heavy restraint harness and clicking the heavy buckles over her chest. Wyatt dropped into the pilot's seat next to her. He didn't waste time on a pre-flight checklist. His hands moved over the battered console with practiced, desperate speed, flipping toggles and punching keys. "Routing power to the main thrusters," he said, his voice tight. "Nav computer is yours. Sync your neural port." Kendra pulled a thick cable from the console. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, feeling the familiar dread. Interfacing with alien tech was always a risk. She reached behind her ear, finding the small circular metal port embedded in her skull, and slotted the cable in. A sharp, electric shock lanced through her brain. Her vision flared white, then settled as the ship's telemetry flooded her mind. She could feel the ship. She could feel the uneven stutter of the port engine. She could feel the massive, terrifying heat of the unstable core sitting in the cargo hold, a ticking bomb right behind their heads. "Core temperature is climbing," Kendra said, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "Containment field at 89%. "Hold on," Wyatt grunted. He grabbed the flight yoke, releasing docking clamps. The ship didn't glide out of the bay. It jerked violently, throwing Kendra against her restraints. The metal collar of her harness dug into her collarbone, right next to her scars. She hissed in pain. "Sorry," Wyatt muttered, not looking away from the viewport. "Sublight engines are a little touchy." They cleared the magnetic field of the bay doors, drifting into the cold, black expanse of space. Below them, the massive orbital station looked like a glowing metallic hive. Kendra brought up the scanner. 3 bright red blips immediately appeared on the edge of the system. "Aegis Cordon patrols," she said, her hands flying over her physical keypad to refine the sensor data. 3 interceptors. They're painting us with targeting lasers. The comms channel crackled, filling the cockpit with a sharp, synthesized voice. "Unregistered freighter. This is Aegis Command. Power down your engines and prepare for boarding. You are entering a restricted zone." Wyatt reached over and slapped the comms off. The silence in the cockpit was sudden and heavy. "Plot the vector," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Right through the middle of the debris field. Calculate the jump to the slipstream on the other side." Kendra's mind raced, processing the massive influx of data from the ship's sensors. The debris field was a chaotic mess of shattered asteroids and old war wreckage. Flying through it at high speed was suicide. "I have the vector," she said, her voice shaking. "But the margin of error is less than 0.2%. If we clip a rock, we die." "Then don't clip a rock," Wyatt said. He grabbed the heavy throttle lever with his right hand. His knuckles went white. He looked over at her, his eyes locking onto hers. The fear was there, raw and human, but underneath it was an iron-clad stubbornness. "Ready?" Kendra squeezed her eyes shut. She thought of Lily. She thought of the credits safely transferred. She had nothing left to lose. "Hit it," she whispered. Wyatt shoved the throttle forward. The acceleration was instantaneous and brutal. It felt like a solid wall of concrete slammed into Kendra's chest. The air was crushed from her lungs in a sharp gasp. Her vision instantly narrowed. A gray vignette creeping into the edges of her sight. The ship screamed, the hull groaning as it was subjected to forces it was never designed to handle. Through the viewport, the stars stretched into long, dizzying streaks of light. 12 Gs, Kendra choked out, fighting against the crushing weight on her chest. Her organic right arm felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her prosthetic arm held firm, the servos screaming in protest as she gripped the console. "Incoming fire!" Wyatt shouted over the roar of the engines. Bright flashes of plasma erupted outside the cockpit window, missing them by meters. The Aegis interceptors were firing, but the outbound was already moving too fast for their targeting computers. They hit the debris field. It was a nightmare of motion. Massive chunks of jagged rock and twisted metal flashed past the viewport. Kendra's brain worked in overdrive, processing the spatial coordinates and feeding micro-corrections to Wyatt's console. "Port thruster, 10 degrees, she screamed. Wyatt yanked the yoke. The ship spun violently on its axis, slipping through a narrow gap between two colliding asteroids. The sheer kinetic force of the maneuver threw Kendra sideways. Her artificial spine locked, absorbing the impact that would have snapped a human neck. "I can't hold this speed," Wyatt yelled, sweat pouring down his face. His arms were trembling wildly as he fought the controls. 30 seconds to the slipstream window, Kendra yelled back, tasting blood in her mouth where she had bitten her tongue. "Keep the nose down." Another burst of plasma fire illuminated the cockpit. One of the interceptors had managed to predict their path. The shot glanced off the rear deflector shield. The entire ship shuddered violently. Alarms began to blare, bathing the cockpit in flashing crimson light. "Shields are down," Wyatt roared. "Next hit cooks the cargo. 10 seconds. Kendra watched the numbers on her screen tick down with agonizing slowness. 5, 4, 3. Mark, jump now. Wyatt slammed his fist onto the heavy red button on the center console. For a single, terrifying second, the universe seemed to stop. The noise, the vibration, the crushing gravity, it all ceased. Then, a massive, violent tearing sensation ripped through the ship as the FTL drive engaged, violently puncturing the fabric of real space. The transition wasn't smooth. It felt like being dragged through shattered glass. Kendra screamed, unable to hold it in, as a wave of intense nausea and vertigo washed over her. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The ship leveled out. The crushing weight vanished, replaced by the smooth, eerie hum of the slipstream. Outside the viewport, the chaotic debris field was gone, replaced by the swirling, hypnotic tunnel of blue and violet light that marked hyperspace. Kendra slumped forward in her harness, gasping for air. Her lungs burned. Every muscle in her body trembled uncontrollably. The servos in her prosthetic arm let out a low, clicking whine, attempting to recalibrate after the immense strain. Beside her, Wyatt let go of the yoke. His hands were shaking so badly he had to press them flat against his thighs to stop them. He leaned his head back against his seat, staring at the ceiling, his chest heaving. For a long minute, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the heavy, ragged breathing of two survivors and the hum of a ship that had no right to still be in one piece. Wyatt turned his head slowly, looking at her. His face was pale, covered in a sheen of sweat. He offered a weak, exhausted smirk. "See?" he rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Told you she was fast." Kendra looked back at him. She tasted the metallic tang of blood and the sour note of adrenaline. She wasn't just cargo anymore. She was part of the machine, and the broken human sitting next to her wasn't a savior. He was just as desperate, just as flawed, and just as deeply ruined as she was. For the first time in 5 years, Kendra let out a genuine, ragged laugh. "You're a madman, Wyatt." "Yeah," he breathed, closing his eyes. "But we're alive." The slipstream offered no sanctuary, only a deceptive, humming quiet. For 3 hours, the only sound was the rhythmic, rattling breath of the ship's scrubbers. Then, the smell hit them. It was sharp and bitter, like burning hair mixed with melting copper wire. Kendra tasted it on the back of her tongue before the primary console alarms even registered the shift. She unspooled the Neuralink cable from her temple port, wincing as a phantom needle of pain shot behind her right eye. The FTL sickness hadn't fully faded. Her stomach was a cold, roiling knot of battery acid and adrenaline. "Wyatt," she croaked. Her throat was painfully dry. "We have a temperature spike in the cargo bay. Sector 3. Wyatt didn't move immediately. He was slumped in the pilot's chair, his chin resting against his chest, eyes half closed. He looked like a corpse. His skin had taken on a grayish, translucent quality under the harsh red cockpit lighting. A thick layer of greasy sweat glued his dark hair to his forehead. Humans, they broke so easily. He finally groaned, the sound tearing out of his throat like rusted metal. He blinked, bleary-eyed, staring at the flashing yellow icon on his primary monitor. "The cooling jacket," he muttered, his voice hoarse. The core's localized containment is eating through the secondary cooling lines. It's at 94 degrees and climbing, Kendra said. She tapped a heavy synthetic finger against the glass of her display. The dull clack echoed in the small space. If it hits 120, the FTL drive's magnetic field will interact with the radiation. We won't just explode. We'll be scattered across 5 different dimensions. I need to vent the ambient heat manually, Wyatt said. He hit the release on his harness. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out instantly. He hit the metal deck hard, his shoulder slamming against the base of the control yoke. Kendra flinched. The sound was a heavy, wet thud. Wyatt! He didn't answer for a long moment. He just lay there, a tangled heap of canvas jacket and exhausted limbs, chest heaving. Slowly, agonizingly, he pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. Blood trickled from a fresh split on his lower lip. "I'm fine," he wheezed, spitting a dark red glob onto the floor grate. "Gravity sickness. My inner ear is still trying to figure out which way is down after that 12G turn." "You can barely stand," Kendra stated flatly. The cynicism in her voice wasn't an act. It was a defense mechanism. She was trapped in a metal tube with a dying human and a melting star. "You're going to pass out in the maintenance crawl space, and I'll be stuck up here piloting a crematorium." Wyatt grabbed the back of his chair, hauling himself upright. His knuckles were bone white. He looked at her, his eyes bloodshot and perfectly lucid. "Then you do it. You've got the armor." He nodded toward her left side. Kendra looked down at her prosthetic arm, then at the thick, raised burn scars crawling up her neck. The memory of the plasma breach flared in her mind, a searing, blinding white heat, the smell of her own flesh turning to ash, the agonizing silence that followed. Her breath hitched. A cold, damp terror settled heavily in her lungs. "I don't do fire," she whispered. Her voice broke. It was a humiliating, pathetic sound, and she hated herself for it. "I can't." Wyatt stared at her. He didn't offer pity. He didn't try to deliver a motivational speech about overcoming trauma. He just let go of the chair, swayed slightly, and wiped the blood from his chin with the back of his dirty sleeve. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." He turned and stumbled out of the cockpit, his heavy boots dragging against the deck plates. Kendra sat in the silence, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The cowardice tasted foul, like old pennies. She watched the telemetry data. 98 degrees, 100 degrees. The ambient temperature in the cockpit was rising now. Sweat beaded on Kendra's forehead, stinging her eyes. Her synthetic arm whined, the microservos expanding slightly in the heat, creating a harsh, grinding friction every time she moved a finger. "He's going to die down there," she thought. "And then I'm going to die up here." 10 minutes passed. 11. The temperature gauge hit 110. The ship was groaning, the bulkheads expanding under the thermal stress. Suddenly, a massive, violent hiss echoed from the rear of the ship. A violent shudder ripped through the floorboards. Kendra gripped the console, her knuckles locking. On her screen, the cargo bay temperature began to plummet. 100. 90. 80. The maintenance comms channel crackled to life. It was just the sound of ragged, wet breathing for several seconds. "Coolant lines." Bypassed. Wyatt's voice crackled over the speaker. He sounded incredibly far away. "I vented the primary reservoir directly over the containment housing. It bought us maybe 6 hours. Total. We drop out of the slipstream in 4, Kendra said, her hands moving over the navigation keys, double-checking the FTL coordinates with frantic precision. "Are you all right?" There was no answer. Wyatt, just the hiss of static. Kendra slammed her fist against the console. She unbuckled her harness, the metal clasps burning her fingers. She practically threw herself out of the chair. Her organic leg ached, a deep, bone-deep throb, but she ignored it, limping heavily down the narrow corridor toward the cargo hold. The air in the rear of the ship was stifling. It was a wet, suffocating heat. A thick cloud of vaporized coolant hung in the air, stinging her eyes and coating her tongue with a chemical sweetness. She found him slumped against the bulkhead just outside the cargo bay doors. His jacket was scorched, the thick canvas blackened and smoking at the edges. His right arm was wrapped tightly around his ribs, and his eyes were closed. The skin on his face was flushed, raw and blistering from the ambient steam. Kendra dropped to her knees beside him. The metal floor was hot enough to burn through the fabric of her trousers. "Wyatt," she said, grabbing his good shoulder and shaking him roughly. His eyes fluttered open. The pupils were blown wide. He looked at her, his gaze wandering aimlessly, before finally focusing on her scarred face. He let out a weak, raspy breath. "You really shouldn't be back here," he mumbled, his head lolling against the metal wall. "It's hot." "You idiot," she hissed, grabbing his good arm and hauling it over her shoulders. "You stupid, fragile, arrogant human. Stand up." With a grunt of pure exertion, she used her prosthetic arm to grab him around the waist, taking almost all of his weight. The servos whined, a high-pitched scream of mechanical strain. But they held. She dragged him away from the cargo bay, back toward the slightly cooler air of the mid-deck. She dropped him unceremoniously onto the narrow bunk in the crew quarters. He groaned, curling inward. Kendra stood over him, her chest heaving. She reached over and yanked the emergency medkit off the wall. She ripped open a packet of thermal gel, the tearing foil loud in the quiet room, and slapped the freezing blue paste over the worst of the burns on his neck and face. Wyatt hissed sharply through his teeth, his body going rigid, but he didn't fight her. "Why?" Kendra asked, her voice harsh, demanding. She dragged a rag across his forehead, wiping away the grease and sweat. "Why did you do that? You could have ordered me to do it. You bought my contract." Wyatt opened his eyes. The cynical, guarded armor was completely gone, stripped away by pain and exhaustion. He looked incredibly young and incredibly tired. "I didn't buy you," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I hired a co-pilot, and you. You said you don't do fire. I respect that." He closed his eyes again, his breathing shallow but steadying. Kendra stood there, staring at him. The rag in her hand was black with dirt. Her prosthetic fingers twitched, a nervous, involuntary spasm. In the brutal, transactional universe she knew, weakness was an invitation for exploitation. You didn't respect someone's trauma. You used it as leverage. But Wyatt hadn't. He had nearly cooked himself alive because she was too terrified to face the heat. She threw the rag onto the small metal sink. The sharp smack made her jump. She turned her back to him, staring out the tiny viewport into the swirling blue madness of the slipstream. 4 hours to the drop, she said to the empty room, her voice finally steady. "Don't die before we get paid." Wyatt just let out a soft, breathy snort of laughter and finally slipped into unconsciousness. The transition to normal space was a shuddering kick in the teeth. The ship screamed in protest, metal groaning as the FTL drive disengaged. Kendra felt her teeth rattle. Beside her, Wyatt gripped the console, his knuckles turning white, his face pale. They had arrived. The coordinates led to an illegal orbital refinery hiding in the shadow of a massive gas giant. It was a sprawling, ugly structure, a rusted tumor clinging to an asteroid, leaking plumes of toxic exhaust directly into the dark void. It had absolutely no official name or recognized transponder signal broadcast. "Sensors are clean," Kendra said, fingers flying over the keypad. The display cast a green glow across her face. "No Aegis patrols, just automated defense turrets. They are not tracking us." Wyatt coughed. "Good." He opened a comms channel. A distorted voice demanded their identity. Wyatt leaned in. "Wyatt, carrying the sun." A long pause followed. Kendra hovered her hand near the shield toggle. Finally, clearance was strictly granted. Docking Bay 7 was a cavernous hole. The interior was dark, lit by sodium lamps. The magnetic clamps engaged with a heavy, final, massive, resonating, deep metallic thud, locking them down. Wyatt unbuckled his harness. He pulled a kinetic pistol from under his seat and racked the slide. He tucked it into his waistband, pulling his scorched jacket over it. "I am coming with you," Kendra stated. She stood up, ignoring the fierce ache in her leg. Wyatt nodded. The airlock cycled open. The smell of sulfur and burnt ozone hit them instantly, mixing with the tang of unwashed bodies. 3 figures waited on the gantry. 2 armored reptilian brutes stood behind a gaunt, gray-skinned alien wearing an immaculate dark business suit. He radiated quiet, cold, absolute, intense, calculating menace. "The core," the gray alien demanded. His voice lacked any accent. "It is in the hold," Wyatt replied. "Containment is failing. Move fast." The 2 brutes pushed past them up the ramp. Minutes crawled by. The gaunt alien stared blankly at Kendra and her exposed servos. Soon, the brutes returned, carrying the massive, glowing crate. Waves of heat warped the air. The alien pulled a sleek data stick from his jacket and tossed it cleanly. Wyatt caught it. 300,000 credits, the buyer said. Transaction concluded. He turned and vanished into the dark shadows of the cold, silent refinery. Wyatt stared at the payment. He shoved it into his pocket. "Let us go," he whispered. They walked back up the ramp. The interior was still stiflingly hot, but the terrifying weight of the core was gone. The ship felt strangely empty. They reached the cramped cockpit. Wyatt collapsed into the pilot seat, not bothering to strap in. He plugged the stick into the console. Kendra sat down heavily and pulled her personal datapad from her belt. A sharp chime cut through the silence. She looked down at the bright screen displaying the exact newly transferred digital credit account balance. Incoming transfer 150,000 credits cleared. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. Hot tears welled up, blurring her vision, but she blinked them away rapidly. She routed the entire sum to a secure account back on the frontier world. Medical debt cleared. Environmental dome, housing paid. Nutritional stipend secured. Her sister was completely safe. She was going to live. The crushing guilt and unending desperation that had suffocated Kendra for years suddenly shattered. She let out a long, shuddering exhale, resting her sweaty forehead against the cool, rigid, synthetic plastic of her small, glowing electronic datapad. "It went through?" Wyatt asked. His rough voice sounded soft. Kendra raised her head slowly and looked across the console. He was staring at his own monitor with an exhausted, genuine smile. "It went through," she confirmed. Her voice felt thick. "My sister is finally safe." Wyatt nodded and rubbed his tired eyes. "Good. My brother is totally free. The collectors will not touch him now. I am a ghost." They sat in the quiet cockpit. The adrenaline crash was brutally heavy. Kendra felt like her bones were made entirely out of solid cast iron and dense poured concrete slabs. Her horrible burn scars throbbed deeply. Her mechanical prosthetic ached, but she had never felt better in her entire life. "So," Wyatt said, breaking the comfortable silence. He turned his head to look straight at her. "Your contract is officially fulfilled. You are rich. You can buy safe passage anywhere in the civilized sector. Core worlds, resort stations, anywhere nice." Kendra looked down at the main console. She examined the flashing yellow lights, the cracked glass screens, and the dirty taped wires. She smelled the lingering burnt ozone and the old stale human pilot sweat soaking into the worn seats. It was ugly. It was highly dangerous. It was perfectly, wonderfully broken. She reached up her cold prosthetic hand, firmly gripping the heavy flight harness, and pulled it tightly across her chest. The thick metal clasp clicked firmly into specific place with a solid, incredibly definitive, loud snap. She synced her neural port. The ship telemetry immediately flooded her active mind, presenting a chaotic, messy, beautiful symphony of raw numerical flight data. "The inner core worlds are terribly boring," Kendra noted, keeping her dark eyes firmly fixed on the bright navigation screen right in front of her tired face now. She began plotting a complicated course out of the system, her fingers dancing rapidly over the keys. "Besides, this bucket of bolts still has a severely misaligned port thruster. The automatic navigation computer will never adequately compensate for it inside an active ion storm." Wyatt stared blankly at her. Slowly, the totally exhausted smile returned much wider this time. He reached out and firmly grabbed the main flight yoke. "You are the navigator," he said smoothly, pulling the ship backward off the large, rusted docking clamps. The ship drifted outward, turning toward the endless black of the outer rim beautifully. If you felt the adrenaline and the raw grit of Kendra and Wyatt's desperate escape, don't leave them stranded. Hit that like button to support their journey, share this story with your fellow sci-fi junkies, and subscribe to the channel for the next thrilling parts of their run. The Aegis Cordon was just the beginning. Drop a comment below on what you think is waiting for them in the Outer Rim. Stay tuned, stay wild, and keep flying.